So communication is a funny thing. Now, as I say that, that statement probably sounds familiar because it's actually the exact phrase I used to launch this series. But the statement is like really, really true, right? Because communication is central, right, to how we connect with one another, how we get to know each other. But the thing is that communication is so important, yet it somehow seems to be difficult, right? It seems to be hard sometimes to say what we want to say. It's certainly challenging in conversations, but in terms of speaking to a large group of people, it's really challenging, right? People come in with different states of mind, different attitudes. People have tons of things going on in their lives, and you walk in here on a Sunday morning, and we're going to be together for an hour or so, but that means that there are 167 other hours this week that have preceded this 1 hour, and we're trying to connect and kind of hear what God has for us in this 1 hour with all that kind of weight coming with us. So as someone who has to speak, or I should say someone who gets to speak to all of you, how do I connect with you? How does any speaker connect with their audience? And there are different tools that have actually developed, literally over thousands of years that speakers have consistently used, right? Going back to ancient Greece and Rome, through the first century into now, there are fundamentally a basic set of tools that speakers use to try to get people's attention and try to connect with them. One of the most fundamental ones is storytelling. But we know that Jesus used that a great deal, that he would tell fictional stories that we called parables to try to paint a picture that taught a lesson. Right? But there are certainly other tools. Humor, right? Humor is a really good tool, a dangerous tool, but when used effectively, it can actually go really well. And then one that I'm a pretty big fan of is hyperbole. Right? Hyperbole is basically making an extreme statement that you say something that you would never want taken literally, but as long as the person who's speaking and the person who hears it has a common frame of reference, hyperbole can often make a point even better than saying something literally. Right? So this week, as we continue our series, Crossed Wires, I've actually titled this message, Like $1 Million. Because like $1 million is a really, really common example of hyperbole, right? Robin and I were talking this morning, right? And I was saying you look really good after your procedure, and that's going really well. And saying you look good is nice, but I said, Rob, you look like $1 million, right? Now, I don't mean she looks like a big stack of money, right? And there's this old joke, I think it's Rodney Dangerfield who said it, is that they told me I look like $1 million, all green and wrinkled, sort of thing. Of course, that's not at all what we mean, right? Is that using a statement like that, an extreme statement that you would never want taken literally, makes the point far more effectively than just saying literally what you want to say. And this is something that comes up all the time, but the thing about hyperbole, just like humor, is that it's an effective tool, but it's a dangerous tool. It can be very, very easily misunderstood, particularly if the speaker and the hearer, again, don't have common frames of reference. An example that happened to me just a couple of years ago. As you guys know, I used to frequently speak at conferences, and I would speak at computer conferences. And computer conferences, like most industries, the universe of speakers is relatively small compared to the overall universe of people who go to conferences. And so what you do is you develop what I used to call my conference friends, is that these are people that I would only see once or twice a year because we were speaking at the same conferences. But it would be this kind of really intense period of time together where you're in the speaker room together for days, you're eating a lot of your meals together. Now, you may not see each other for another 10 months, but there are people that I've been conference friends with for like 20 years. And so I get to know them really well. And one of my conference friends is this PhD from France. And he's a wicked smart guy, really smart guy, super nice guy. And one morning at a conference on the first day, I ran into him in the morning at breakfast. Now, as you probably know, Americans eat way more food than Europeans do, right? So when you go to a conference breakfast in the United States, there is lots and lots of food that you wouldn't normally find if you were in Europe. So I walk up to my French friend, and he's got this plate that looks like he's an American, right? So he's got a pile of eggs on there, a pile of bacon, pile of fried potatoes, and I don't eat like that anymore, right? There was a time when I did, but I kind of start my day pretty light. So I walked up to him, I said, man, that breakfast is going to kill you. And he put the plate down. He's like, oh, has the food spoiled? Right? Now, he thought that I was saying that the food was literally going to kill him because he speaks English as a second language, right? I've been speaking English since the beginning. I'm sure there are tons of French jokes I wouldn't get. In fact, any of them, as a matter of fact, right? But that was the thing there, is that although hyperbole, really effective, can easily create confusion. And so one of the challenges that we have as we look at the things that Jesus says, we don't always have a common frame of reference. And it's important to understand that Jesus sometimes used hyperbole when he said things. He used extreme statements to make a point. And many of these statements would have been very clear to listeners in the first century, but they seem confusing to us. And we kind of have an added challenge, is that one of the things that I've seen over time is that when people read their Bibles or when they hear people talk about the Bible, people often kind of fall into this very reverent mode. And they start to see everything as very, very literal. And although reverence is a good thing, it's important to understand that what we're reading is documents talking about people's lives. And so as Jesus is engaging with people, he's using these various speaking tools to make a point, one of which is hyperbole. But if we try to interpret those statements literally, it's going to be very confusing to us. In fact, sometimes it can even be emotionally painful if we take certain statements too literally. So with all that in mind, what I want to do today is look at one of the most difficult statements that Jesus ever made for me, that it took me years to understand what he was saying here. And to be honest with you, as I prepared this week's message, my depth of understanding grew. So even as I kind of got greater understanding over the years, it wasn't really until my kind of work this week that I started to fully understand this statement. And again, the statement actually looks kind of offensive. So let's jump into the statement and let's talk about it. So this statement is documented for us by Luke. And Jesus says, so there's a crowd with him. He turns to the crowd, and it seems like out of nowhere. He just turns to them and says, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father, mother, wife, children, brothers, sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Now, any way you look at it, that statement looks really, really harsh. But here's the thing. He's actually trying to teach people about love, about how to actually love one another. But it seems buried in this really, really challenging statement. I mean, it doesn't seem buried. It is buried in this very challenging statement. And what he's trying to do is just make a very specific point about what it means to be his follower. Now, one of the things that we have to understand is that, so often when we look at any aspect of the Bible, particularly the Gospels, the 4 books talking about the life of Jesus, we have this tendency, or at least I often had this tendency, to look at each thing I read in isolation. Like, whatever is happening in this one little paragraph or this one little verse that I'm reading, this is the only place that it happens. But in reality, over Jesus' ministry, right, he didn't have the internet, he didn't have, radio, he didn't have television. So he would commonly give the same talks over and over again because he would speak to various audiences over time. And the composition of those audiences was often very different. Because we know across the 4 Gospels, Jesus multiple times kind of gives this talk about what it means to be his disciple. In fact, in this case, he's giving it to a large crowd. But the first case we have of it is when he sends the 12 apostles out. So as he sends the 12 apostles out, remember, those would have been his closest followers, right? Those folks who know him well. But in addition to that, he also, after he sends the 12 apostles out, a short time later, he sends out what's often called the 72, or the 72 disciples. Is that basically Jesus first sends the 12 apostles out, and they do their thing, and then later he develops more disciples, and the next thing he does is he sends this group of 72 disciples out to do very similar things that the apostles were called to do. And each time he sends these groups out, he gives them a talk about what it means to be a disciple. So he tells them the sort of things they should do, he tells them how they should act, and he tells them how they should care for people. So even though Jesus was telling each group basically the same thing, he would often do it in slightly different ways. And as far as we know, this is the only case where he uses the word hate. He usually talks more specifically about love. And what he does, he actually talks about relative love, about loving God above others. So because of that, many Bibles that you use, or many Bible translations that are translated to English, they'll actually contextualize this statement a little bit. In this particular Bible, the New American Standard Bible that I'm using here, they actually add a footnote to it. And the footnote says that hate, well, in comparison to me, in other words, in comparison to Jesus, or in comparison to God. And now for his first century listeners, that would also be a picture of pointing to Jesus as God. Because in the first century tradition, the only thing that came above family was God. So Jesus is painting that picture, first of all, that if I come before family, then I must be God. And so he's trying to kind of paint that picture for them. But kind of the other aspect of it here, in terms of saying love in some cases and hate in this one case. And again, it comes back to what audience that he is talking to. Because they said that the first documentation we have for this is when he sends the 12 apostles out. And in that case, the wording he uses is, if you love father, mother, son, or daughter more than me, you can't be my disciple. Now, that's still a really tough statement. But certainly, love more is far easier to take than hate. Right? So why is it so different? Well, again, who are the apostles? Right? The apostles were his closest followers. They were the ones who had been with him since the beginning. They were the ones, to the best of their ability, believed what he was teaching. So in a sense, they were a very friendly audience. They were already bought in to who he was and what he was doing. So he could speak to them very directly about layers of love. So that means there must be something different about this other audience where he uses hate. And we'll get to that part in a minute. But the key thing we want to understand is that Jesus is talking about creating these layers of love. And if we think about how most of us think, certainly how I thought for most of my life, I mean, why would I love anyone more than my wife? Honestly, even God, why would I love anyone more than my wife? Because that seems inverted to me. That seems wrong to me. So we'll talk a bit more about that as we go along. So we kind of have these two things we're trying to wrestle with. Why does Jesus say the same thing so differently to one audience? And then why is he saying that it seems that I shouldn't love my family? Why would he say something like that? Well, let's first look at this language, hate. Why did he, in this one particular case, say hate rather than love more? Well, we have to understand where the apostles were already his followers, who were already bought into what he was doing. This is talking to a very large crowd that is traveling with him. And we need to understand how these crowds came to be. Right? Is that these crowds occurred not necessarily because they believed in who Jesus was. What was happening is that as time went on, Jesus was doing things like healing people. Well, word gets around about healing people. He would have these events where he would feed huge groups of people. In fact, it's very well documented that after he would feed these huge groups of people, suddenly a whole bunch of those people started following him. Why were they following him? Free meal, baby, free meal, right? It's a time where finding food's hard. This guy's just making it out of nothing. We're going to stick with him, right? And he actually, in that case, he actually takes those people on very directly. But also we want to remember that a growing number of people were starting to believe that he was the Messiah, that he was the promised one. But what did they expect that the Messiah would do? He would rise up as a conqueror, right? Crush the Romans and start his own kingdom. So what's happening is that Jesus has this group of people who are following him physically. In other words, they're walking along and traveling with him, but they're not following his teaching. They're not focused on his teaching. What are they doing? They are motivated by self-interest. What's happening is that they're following him around because they want to be first in line for whatever the next thing he's handing out is. Right? If he's handing out food, I want to be first in line. If me or my family members are sick, I want to be first in line for that healing. And if he does rise up and become king, I want to be first in line for those cool jobs that he's handing out. So what happens is that he's got this whole crowd, probably a very large crowd, that are filled with people who are following him entirely out of self-interest. What's in it for me? What can I gain by following Jesus? And what does Jesus teach? Right? Is that our faith is not meant to be anchored in self-interest. Right? Our faith is to be anchored in, and our actions are to care for others, not be focused in self-interest. So when Jesus makes this statement about hating father and mother, wife and children, he's talking to the what's in it for me crowd. And he's using hyperbole to get their attention. Right? That you guys are following along just because you want to see what you can get out of this deal. So he chose words that would kind of shock them out of that thinking. They wouldn't have necessarily known where he was going, but they certainly would have heard that. In other words, you're here for what you can get. Well, you're going to have to make a lot of hard choices if you come this direction. And so he's trying to break them out of that state of mind. Basically, he's focusing on them very directly and saying, you are here for what you think you're going to get. And this relationship is about what you will be able to give. That if you're going to be my disciple, your focus needs to be on what you can give to other people, what you can do for other people, for how you can care for other people. And that's why, to be my disciple, God has to be above everything, including your family, including yourself. Now again, that's better than that kind of extreme idea of hate. But even that, how is putting God above family and self, how does that have anything to do with love? How is that about God's got to be in front of them and you've got to hate them? How does that have anything to do with love? Well, what is Jesus talking about? Right? He's talking about this is the way things will be if you are my disciple. Well, what does it mean to be a disciple? If you're a disciple of Jesus, what does that mean? Well, I figured I would look up the word and see what it says. So I went to the dictionary and I looked up the word disciple. And this is based on the Merriam-Webster dictionary. I made one little tweak to make it Christian specific, but basically the definition is just what comes out of Merriam-Webster. It says a disciple is one who accepts and assists in spreading the teachings of Jesus. So accept, what does that mean? It means I believe, right? I believe what he teaches. But if all I do is just believe, that's not really a disciple, that's a fan, right? I like what he says. To be a disciple, we have to go one step further. We actually have to assist in spreading his teaching. So how do we do that? How do we assist in spreading his teaching? Well, one way we can do it is to do what I'm doing right now, right? Is talk to groups of people about what's going on, what we believe. Now, most of us don't get a lot of chances to do that, right? But we can also still talk about it in our lives, right? We can actually have conversations, and when the opportunity presents itself talk about what we believe, and that's a good way to do it too. But there's actually even a better way than both what I'm doing right now and what we can do in conversation. What's the best way to spread the teaching of Jesus? The way we live our lives, right? How we act, how we interact with people, what we do, right? And what that has to do, that has to extend to every aspect of our lives, right? It has to extend to our relationships. We have to relate to other people in a way that's consistent with the teachings of Jesus, right? We have to treat everyone, family, friends, and strangers in a way that's consistent with the teaching of Jesus. It has to extend to our business, right? We have to do business in a way that's consistent with the teaching of Jesus. We don't take advantage of people. We have high integrity. We are always above board with money. We are always above board with every conversation. Those sort of things will do far more to spread the teaching of Jesus than anything any of us can say. And that's the point that Jesus is trying to make here, that in order to be my disciple, in order to be part of spreading this teaching, this message, you need to let these teachings permeate every aspect of your life. Now, one of the things is that, well, how can I incorporate everything that Jesus teaches throughout my life? Well, the good news is that if we look at what Jesus teaches us, there aren't 1,000 things we have to know. There aren't 100 things we have to know. He doesn't even point back to 10 things we have to know. He points to one. At the end of his ministry, after 3 years of walking around, teaching, talking, telling stories, what did he say? This is my commandment. Love one another, just as I have loved you. And after he did that, what did he do? He died to connect us with God. So after he makes that statement, he put his love for you and his love for me ahead of his own self-interest. He put his care for you and his care for me ahead of caring for himself. So as his disciples, that's the life that we're being called to live, a life that is focused on and centered on love. So what Jesus is telling us here is that when he says that you've got to put God above family and self, what he is telling us is that we have to be centered on love, because how do we love God? How do we demonstrate our love for God? We demonstrate our love for God by loving his children, right? Because we think about in our own lives, right, that if someone does something that offends you personally, some business deal, some personal thing, yeah, you can kind of get over that over time, right? But if someone does something harmful to your children and then calls you up and says, hey, can I take you to lunch? I'm hoping we can do business together. Until they're right with your kids, they ain't never going to be right with you. So the way we are loving towards God is being loving towards his kids, to his children, to live our lives in such a way that we care for the people around us. So what Jesus is pointing out is that if my love is focused just on what's good for me or what's good for my family, then that's conditional love. And Jesus' love was not conditional. That's loving people only when there's something in it for us. The mark of being Jesus' disciple is unconditional love. Love for everyone. Loving people even when there's nothing in it for us, especially when there's nothing in it for us. That's the point that he is making with these statements, that if we put God above everything, then we love everyone, and we are loving towards everyone, and we act in a way that is consistent with love for everyone. So we have to always choose to do what's right. We have to always choose to do what's consistent with being a follower of Jesus. And not just what's convenient for us, but be willing to step out and take chances, right? And be willing sometimes even to let go of what you're owed. You may be rightfully owed something, but if actually being willing to let that go benefits someone who's in a more difficult position than you, that's how we're loving. We're not focused on what's our right to have. We're not focused on what we deserve. What we do is we love without condition. We love others just like Jesus loves you, just like Jesus loves me. That is his entire point in this very hyperbolic statement, to get our attention, to get their attention, and recognize that love for everyone has to be front and center. So in the week ahead, let's just take this week and say, this week I'm going to try to live as fully as a disciple of Jesus as I possibly can, and actively do that. So how do we even do that? Well, I think we ask ourselves a question. What can I do to put love for someone else ahead of my own immediate self-interest? And as we ask that question and you find the answer, just do it. Just do it. See, here's the amazing thing, right, is that when we love people consistent with the way that Jesus calls us to, we become more aware of God's love for us. And that is a life-changing circumstance. Is that when we move from this idea of, well, yeah, I know God loves me, to where, wow, when I start to think about what happens when I step out and I'm willing to be uncomfortable to demonstrate love for someone, I start to see much more deeply how God loves me. And that connects us to God in a whole new way, and it connects us to one another in a whole new way. And so in this week ahead, as we head out, just each of us, just embrace this opportunity. Let's embrace this gift to be connected more deeply to God by being loving to all those around us.